Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week I have a few news articles to chat about. The first one I wanted to talk about is Snowflake had an unauthorized user access that they detected about a month ago. But this week there was some more reporting that came out that said there were about as many as 165 customers that had their information potentially exposed as part of an ongoing campaign designed to facilitate data theft and extortion, indicating the operation has broader implications than previously thought. Now, to be transparent, Snowflake has about 9,000 or more global customers. And if you're not familiar with Snowflake, it is a data warehouse platform that runs over AWS or Azure cloud infrastructure and allows organizations to scale up the processing of enormous amounts of big data. So they basically have these SQL servers that they house that you can feed data from your AWS or Azure infrastructure to it, where they can house it for you and process massive amounts of data. So pretty important stuff, because if they're compromised, then you're going to have a lot of data, who knows what, being able to be scraped by the attackers, and which is, we'll get into what they're doing, but that's essentially what they're doing. So Mandiant, which is owned by Google now, assisted with the incident response, and they're tracking the as yet unclassified activity cluster under the name UNC 5537, describing it as a financially motivated threat actor. They're compromising Snowflake customer instances using stolen customer credentials, then advertising victim data for sale on cybercrime forums, and attempting to extort many of the victims. The campaign, which was previously outlined by Snowflake in a release, stems from a compromised customer credentials that were purchased from cybercrime forums and obtained through information stealing malware. And they gave a couple examples here. Maybe you're familiar with them: Luma, MetaStealer, Raccoon, Redline, RisePro, Vidar. And it was believed to have started on April 14th, 2024. Now, here's the important part, which I thought was super interesting. In several instances, the Stealer malware infections have been detected on contractor systems that were also used for personal activities, such as gaming and downloading pirated software, and the latter of which has been a tried and tested conduit for distributing the stealers. The unauthorized access to customer instances have paved the way for reconnaissance utility dubbed as Frostbite that is used to run SQL queries and glean information about users' current roles, current IPs, session IDs, and organization names. Snowflake, in an update, said it's working closely with its customers to harden their security, and it's developing a plan to require them to implement advanced security controls like MFA and network policies. From the incident response, Mandiant pointed out that the attacks have been hugely successful due to three main reasons: a lack of MFA, not rotating credentials periodically, and missing checks to ensure access from trusted locations. Now, Adam, I want your thoughts on this, because, Mandiant have these three main reasons. MFA, obviously, that's baseline table stakes. If you don't have MFA, you're way, way behind the power curve today. But the other two, not rotating credentials periodically and then access from trusted locations, that can be argued as, weaker controls, in my opinion. And in this case, if you already have MFA and then you steal the credentials, that in itself should prevent the majority of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. But there are other methods of controls like compliant machines, controls. For contractors, I know it can get kind of dicey of enrolling their devices into MFA. So, I want to hear what your thoughts on this, because this definitely comes up a lot in manufacturing among my customers, how to control access to corporate data from contractors. But for sure, MFA is definitely a control you should have. Rotating credentials, arguably can be helpful in some cases, especially if you believe the credentials have been compromised. Trusted locations, again, can be helpful, but understand that your network location can also get compromised. So from a VPN standpoint, if you're forcing them to go through that, you can't just trust a location implicitly all the time.
Before I say anything else, the usual disclaimer: Andy and I work for Microsoft. We work in our security sales business in the field. Snowflake is interesting in that it's both a competitor as well as kind of a partner, I suppose. We announced a partnership at Microsoft Build recently, but generally seen as a competitor to Microsoft Fabric and Power BI and those sort of data like and focused solutions from Microsoft. So, as always on this show, I point out Microsoft does not fund our show, does not have editorial control over our show. And when we talk about things like this with competitors to our employer, we're doing so in an academic sense. What can we learn? What can our listeners and viewers take away from it? So just want to point out, not intended to denigrate or attack a competitor. That's not the purpose. It's just learning. Obviously, Microsoft has had some security incidents in the last year or so. And so certainly we are not sitting in our glass house and throwing stones. Just want to point that out. So let's start with the last thing first. Andy, you mentioned some of the guidance from Mandiant, and it was 3-pronged on multi-factor authentication. Yes, please. Doing credential rotation. Now, what I'm going to guess they're referring to, and maybe I'm giving too generous of the benefit of the doubt, but I'm going to try, is I think it's pretty well established that for humans, credential rotation is bad because of the limitations of humans, because it is hard for us to memorize multiple passwords, especially when they change frequently, and make them all high quality. That, however, does not apply to something that is machine readable or machine used. So things like API keys or shared secrets that are only used between machine to machine and are never intended to be memorized by a carbon-based life form, there is still value in rotating those. And so I'm going to assume that's what Mandiant's getting at, are doing rotation of those sorts of things within a Snowflake environment. You should rotate API keys. You should rotate those sorts of things as time goes on. So that's my guess. Trusted locations, I think it's a weak control. It's probably better than no control if you don't have the ability to do some sort of better validation of the entire factors related to a sign-in. You're not able to look into the factors around the sign-in, around the user identity, around the device they're using, around the status of and health of the EDR platform. If you can't do all that, then at least limiting it to a trusted location, although not a strong control and should not engender a tremendous amount of trust, is probably better than nothing. I would propose you should limit all access to something like Snowflake through a strong cloud identity provider that does have those things and just gate it that way. So if Snowflake doesn't offer it, use someone who does, like a Microsoft or an Okta or a Ping. So overall, I don't have a whole lot to add here. What's interesting is I saw rumblings of this over the past week or two on Twitter, and there was a lot of torches lit and pitchforks out that Snowflake was hiding something, and there was some systemic compromise of accounts, and this must be coming from inside the house. And it sounds like, based on the reporting you shared, Andy, it's a targeted attack on Snowflake customers. But ultimately, when Snowflake said, no, this is our individual customers being susceptible to attacks and having, in some ways, poor security posture, that sounds like that is the case. And so it's a good reminder for our listeners and our viewers that you should have a deep understanding of the responsibilities you share and the responsibilities your cloud service provider or SaaS provider or PaaS provider or IaaS provider has for their responsibility. And we did a show on this not too long ago about that exact topic, Andy, the shared responsibility model. But it is worth reiterating. Know for every service that you have, what's your responsibility? Because it sounds like there may have been a disconnect there because, again, I'll be generous and use the benefit of the doubt. I think if most security engineering departments knew about this posture inside of their Snowflake environment, they would have done more. And for whatever reason, again, maybe this was stood up by another part of the business. Maybe they didn't have line of sight to it. Maybe they misunderstood if this was gated by their identity provider. Whatever the case may be, I think they would have done better. So ultimately, I think what can help our listeners and readers sleep well at night is it does not appear that this was anything like a back-end break-in and they were getting into Snowflake environments through those means. However, it does appear that everyone could stand to do a health check of your Snowflake environment and your configuration and harden it as appropriate. So I think some opportunity to improve, but also ultimately, in a world where there's a major security incident every other week and a major breach, if you will, this actually is not one of them. It's just, I think, again, a lack of an understanding of the shared responsibility model, and I think an opportunity for all of us to do better.
I think one of the things that you mentioned, which is essentially federating the application and the authentication through an identity provider, is extremely important. That should be part of any corporate identity strategy, is for any SaaS service to federate it through your identity provider, like you said, Entra, Okta, Ping, whatever it is. And then, of course, multi-factor.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, because Adam, you and I and a few of our coworkers in our group chat had talked about this recently, about what do you do in the case of, the host machine and maybe a RDP session to a virtual machine, right? Whether it's like a Windows 365 or Amazon Workspace or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is probably, in my opinion, the best way to provide secure access to a corporate environment,
Mm-hmm.
is provide them with, a virtual machine, essentially. And ideally, when you log into the virtual machine, you do it without having to enter in a password, because these compromised credentials, they may be, what's the term? Sniffing the keys or
machine in the middle, adversary in the middle.
Why is the term escaping me? Like they're reading your keys as you're entering them in. Keylogger. Yeah. So they might be a keylogger, and so ideally they're federated with identity provider that you can log into passwordless and use the virtual machine to access Snowflake or any other sensitive application. So that's probably what I would do. But of course, like as Adam said, this is an opportunity to take a look at any one of your critical applications, make sure that the configuration is correct, make sure that it's federated with your identity provider. And then, if you don't have a secure method for contractors, this is kind of a wake-up call to have a plan for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the plug there, for any sort of remote desktop-based model, Windows 365 is one of them. It's a good one. Azure Virtual Desktop's another good one. And then other providers have them as well. But I think I am shocked whenever I hear contractors having hardware. I just don't know why. That's just give
Their
them a
own
virtual
hardware.
machine.
Their
No,
own hardware, right?
provided hardware. You shouldn't provide them hardware. You shouldn't ship them a laptop.
Yeah.
And even worse is having them use like their own contracting laptop. I mean, those are both bad choices. I mean, just give them a cloud PC and Windows 365 and call it a day. Like,
Yeah.
it's secure. You can take it away at any time. You don't have to hope they will ship their hardware back to you, et cetera, et cetera. It's the right model.
All right. Our next story is about Finley Automotive Group, and it's one of the largest auto groups in Nevada, with dealerships in Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Washington, and Idaho. They recently suffered a cybersecurity issue, which turned out to be ransomware. And it's reported that they're losing millions of dollars a day in revenue because all their IT systems are down, and you need your computer systems to sell a car, to be able to look up credit checks and apply for loans, and for your service department to be able to look up parts and service orders and contact headquarters on recalls and safety issues and all of that. So without computers and IT systems, any auto dealer is pretty much dead in the water, as with most organizations these days. And they're actually getting a class action lawsuit that was filed against them, claiming that they failed to protect sensitive customer information, because some of the information that Finley Automotive could have exposed as part of this ransomware attack are names, addresses, social security numbers, insurance policy numbers, credit and debit card numbers, and other financial information needed to sell, buy, or lease a vehicle. And I have always thought this, but cybersecurity at auto dealerships is generally a pretty big issue. Some of these automotive groups are small and they're like mom and pop shops. This one's one of the larger ones, so they probably have more dedicated IT and probably more funding for cybersecurity tools. But next time you go and like buy a car or even get your car serviced, kind of swing around and see what kind of operating system the people who are helping you are using. Many of them are like on old hardware, old software, and these software packages can't be upgraded, and sometimes they're using like Windows 7 still, or Windows 8 or whatever. And if you buy a car, you'll see that they print these agreements and stuff on carbon paper through like a dot matrix printer, the ones with the little holes that you used to roll and have to feed into it, which is exactly what they do. They feed a form through this printer and then it prints off. And, I just think technology is so crucial to them, but securing it in all these old systems, it's taking a while for them to catch up and update. So cybersecurity, they're definitely at risk at any of these auto dealers. But so ransomware is still an issue, right? And still happening. We've been talking about it for over a decade now, and there's still people who are getting hit, still losing money from it, and still impacting systems. So just another day in the cybersecurity world.
This one is interesting. An interesting reminder to our viewers and listeners that articulating risk to the business in a fact-based way, but also presenting the worst case scenario, but also not sounding like you're telling them the sky is falling, is a hard needle to thread, especially in a business like this that is so sales driven. And salespeople do not want friction in the sales process. It is amazing how the moment when you go buy a car, which is a major purchase, the moment you say, yeah, I want to buy that, things happen really fast. They want to take as much friction out of that process as possible before you change your mind. And being able to articulate like, hey, this technology is an enabler for us to be successful. And the faster we can streamline this process, the better off we are. And so I have dealers around me locally here in the greater Des Moines area. One of them advertises that you can buy a car in under an hour. They run it on all their TVs. They brag about it because, if you've ever bought a car, you can be sitting there all afternoon, again, while the impact printer is printing off the carbon paper and the sales guy's ripping off the holes on the side and separating them out. And here's your pink copy and sign here. And here's your yellow copy. And yeah, it can be a thing. I think the extra challenge here, and I'll admit I'm ignorant as to the exact software that powers this business, but what I've been able to figure out, like Andy talked about, is you kind of, look a little what's going on. It appears that a lot of these software packages are very monolithic. They do everything. They power the website, they power the inventory, they power the entire sales and point of sale process, they power the repair and service department as well. It's all running on some single monolithic software package. You think there's a lot of Microsoft Teams? You should see the software that runs an auto dealership. It's incredible. Everything is together. And I would imagine there's very little competition, because I've noticed no matter what dealership I go to, all the printouts look exactly the same. Like from the service department, looks the same every service department you've ever been to. The printouts are worded the same, the language is the same, the formatting's the same. They're all running the same package, whatever it is. So certainly, again, I guess what's the takeaway for our listeners? Like Andy said, ransomware is still a thing. But I think the bigger takeaway is, again, like for people who basically don't want to slow down, don't want to invest in things other than sales, this is where you point to this event and say, well, if we don't take care of it, this could happen. And these are the negative outcomes. And this is not a flying car, no pun intended. This is something that's actually happening. This is real. This is not made up. This is not a someday thing. And I think, again, I've worked with salespeople in supportive roles as well as being a salesperson now. And I understand the resistance to anything that creates friction, but we are so reliant on computer systems to run so many businesses today. And it is to the point when if computers are down, we can't do business. And so what's the risk of that? We have to articulate that and get sign off and true understanding of that to be effective in our jobs and to get the funding we need. Because a place like Finley Auto Group should have had in their, potential list of outcomes the complete shutdown of business and new sales and service for over a week. And what's the cost of that? And what's the potential, the possibility of that happening? Well, here's how we should invest in our cybersecurity operations. And I'd be willing to bet and make an unsubstantiated claim that their cybersecurity was probably underfunded.
And the other issue that I think is coming up more and more often, especially in the age of AI and all of this generative, AI and all that, is data protection.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are in a business where you have customer facing data and you're storing it, you need to ask yourself, why am I storing that stuff? Credit card numbers, that should have been something that you don't store at all anymore, because that's a old age. If you're still swiping credit cards, then you're reading the numbers, but most of the transactions these days should be using the chip.
Tokenized anyway.
Tokenized, exactly. Yeah. And so you're not actually reading the cards numbers anymore, and certainly not storing them. And social security numbers, you shouldn't be storing them. It's funny because I think back to like 2013, 2014 timeframe, I bought a vehicle and they wanted me to fill out this form, including, all of my sensitive data so that I could apply for a loan with them. And I remember looking at the site and it was HTTP, and I went and told them, I'm like, hey, how is this transmitted? Because this is looks like it's going to be in the clear. And of course they look at me with deer eyes in a headlight, basically. Yeah. They have no idea. I'm like, can I just fill it out on a piece of paper and give it to you instead? And then you give me the paper back. But yeah, so I mean, think about the forms you're asking your customers to fill out if you're in this type of business, what data you're storing and why. And if you don't need it, you should get rid of it. There's no reason to keep social security numbers, credit card numbers, insurance policies, any of that stuff. Name and address, I can understand. Usually you have a customer database of the previous sales and whatnot. But yeah, this is again an opportunity to ask yourself, from a lessons learned aspect, what data am I storing? Do I need to keep it? Because if I don't, you should get rid of it. you should have data retention policy. You should have a data protection policy. All of that. So think about that as a takeaway.
That comes up on Richard Campbell from Run As Radio and Windows Weekly uses the phrase all the time now that in the AI era, he hears over and over again, you need to get your data state in order. And when I got hired at Microsoft, that was part of my job, was helping folks with their information protection and information governance and all of that. And it was just, it never was a priority. And I think it's finally becoming a priority because so many things depend on having your data state in order.
All right, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the Olympics. I'm a huge Olympics fan.
Yeah.
This year is the Summer Olympics 2024 in Paris, and the opening ceremonies are less than 2 months away. Recently, both Microsoft and Recorded Future came out with reports warning about the cyber threat and about Russia and how they're trying to disrupt the games this year. Microsoft's report warned that Russia has two main objectives: denigrate the reputation of the IOC,
Not hard.
international, and create the expectation of violence breaking out in Paris at the games. Recorded Future said that there's going to be multifaceted threats, including criminal activity from cyber criminals who are trying to exploit the games, launch ransomware attacks against governments, hospitality, transportation, logistics, and healthcare. And then additionally, the Olympic-themed phishing scams are anticipated to target businesses and attendees. So any organization that's involved in the Olympics should heighten awareness of phishing and prioritize patching high-risk vulnerabilities. Hacktivists will likely attempt cyber disruptions to protest support for Ukraine and Israel. And there's also, again, Recorded Future is warning about state-sponsored espionage and influence operation. They're expected to be restrained due to France's NATO membership, but they're likely to escalate because they're wanting to use the Olympic theme to gather intelligence and influence operations from Russia, Iran, and amplify some narratives that are critical of France, NATO, and Israel. And then, of course, there's always some threat of physical violence and physical security. Supporters of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in Europe are most certainly intended to target the Olympics with terrorist attacks. Wide array of ideological-driven protest groups are also trying to seek to disrupt the Olympics to advance their agendas. So a lot of different threats. Both of these reports, if you're an Olympic fan like myself, they're really good reads. They're not too long, but it does talk about some of the threats that both Microsoft and Recorded Future are seeing. And with Microsoft, they actually started last year in like some Telegram groups and started seeing activities about targeting the Olympics, and then they've escalated since then. But this is going to be continually monitored from a threat intelligence standpoint by both organizations and probably other ones across in the world.
This is already the third Olympic Games since we started this show, Andy. Tokyo obviously was delayed to 2021, Beijing, the Winter Games in 22, and now the Paris Games, which should be the first ones with fans in the stands since we started the show this summer. And I agree, really excited. Sorry, I couldn't help but cracking a joke there about denigrating the reputation of the IOC.
I know.
If you didn't get the joke, the International Olympic Committee is often accused of turning a blind eye to human rights violations and awarding the games to countries that are attempting to do sports washing, like China and Russia, to name a few, as well as being corrupt in terms of how games are awarded and how they choose who wins the next games, usually accusations of money exchanging hands in order to win those awards. So this feels kind of standard at this point. Like you could almost do this paint by numbers. It doesn't mean the threats aren't legitimate, though. And I think that's the hard part to overcome, is we are accustomed to hearing before every games that there will be the potential for terrorist threats, that a lot of folks will be using the attention of the world to draw attention to their own campaigns that are near and dear to their hearts, whether they are for good or for evil. Again, it's one of those where just because we've heard this before doesn't mean we shouldn't take it seriously. So it is interesting to follow. Generally speaking, even the worst of our fears have thankfully mostly not been realized when it comes to the games. I think really not since Atlanta 96 has there actually been a loss of life at a games in the recent history. So that's positive, and I hope that trend continues. And really, really looking forward to this. Obviously, so much fun to bring the world together and see the best of the world compete. Is so much fun, and really, really looking forward to it. And the opening ceremony as of now, Andy, is still planned to be each delegation from the countries actually on boats down the Seine River in Paris, like on the river, as like a rolling opening ceremony. And there are still concerns that may be scuttled due to security concerns, because that sounds amazing. So I really hope they're able to pull that off securely and safely. But yeah, this is great threat intel from our employer, Microsoft, as well as Recorded Future, friend of the show, Charity Wright, from over there on as well. So, fingers crossed for a peaceful, successful games. It's good to have the games again in a country that is promoted to Western ideals and democracy and freedom, because it is, obviously Japan shares those feelings with us, but it feels like those games were so overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic that they just didn't get the attention they deserved. And that's a shame for our friends over in Japan, because I think the Tokyo games could have been magnificent, and the ratings were very poor. And I think a lot of people's attention was elsewhere by the time they finally happened. So really looking forward to this. And again, fingers crossed. But to our viewers and listeners, your takeaway, of course, is, as always, be vigilant, take it seriously, and do your part in highlighting any threats that you see emerging from this that are trying to leverage this great event that's supposed to bring people together and using its name for nefarious purposes.
Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks, as always, for watching and listening. All the links to what we talked about tonight will be in the show notes, as well as our contact information if you have questions, comments, or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.